So sometimes we respond incorrectly because it's just natural to respond that way, and sometimes our responses are misunderstood. But what we're going to talk about today, see, Apostle Paul is going to unpack a situation for us, and he's going to indirectly, and when I say indirectly, he doesn't tell us you need to respond this way. He just points out, this is how I respond in this situation. But he's going to point out, hey, with this group of people, here's how we really need to be thinking, and here's where our response needs to be. Because sometimes our response is wrong, not because it was misunderstood, but because deep down we lack empathy and compassion. And so whenever we think about people that are hurting or people that get bad news, if you are unable to feel for them, like there's a problem. And we're going to talk about one specific group that I think sometimes we don't respond with empathy or compassion, or with compassion rather, and sympathy. I think we respond with apathy. And I hope that we can kind of get dialed in to thinking the way that we're supposed to think. So we're going to be in Philippians chapter 3, verses 15 and following today. And our passage is just a continuation on what Paul talked about last week when he said, look, when I've had the things of this world, and I've had like self-righteousness, but when I compare that to Jesus, Jesus trumps everything. I'd rather have Jesus than all the riches in the world stacked up upon themselves. And he's like, and I want to keep pursuing Jesus at the expense of all this stuff, because there's nothing you could show me that's in this world that compares to Jesus. So he continues on in this, and he says, now, not only should I think this way, but in verse 15, all of us who are mature should take such a view. And if on some point you think differently, that too God will make clear to you. So this is Paul's way of saying, he's like, and if on some point you think differently, he's saying, if you disagree with me on this, maybe God will show you where you're wrong. That's basically what he's just said, okay? Which is a terrible way to have an argument with somebody, especially your spouse. Don't say, well, honey, maybe God will just show you where you're wrong. Unless you really like sleeping on the couch, then by all means, go with this. Like, have this as a regular part of in your ammo when you argue with somebody. But he's basically saying, look, those of us who are mature and who are growing in our relationship with Jesus, we should be at a place where we look at the things of this world and look at Jesus and think, Jesus is better. And if you don't think that way, ask God to kind of bring you clarity so you begin thinking that way. But then he kind of ends with this line in verse 16, like we'll just agree to disagree on this, but one thing we have to be about is let us live up to what we have already attained. So you may disagree with me on this, but what we all need to be doing is continuing to grow in our relationship with Jesus and trying to live up to what we've already been given through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, which is things like forgiveness of sins and perfection and eternity in God's presence. We've been given that. It was a gift. It was grace. You can't do anything to earn it or to impress God to make him give you more of it. It's like you've got it because of Jesus. And he says, live in light of that sacrifice, live in honor of that sacrifice, and continue to try to grow in honoring of that sacrifice. Let us live up to what we've already been given, because it's already ours in the first place. And then he wants to tell them, like, well, here's how this looks, because that sounds like a daunting task. And he says in verse 17, join together in following my example, brothers and sisters, and just as you have us as a model, keep your eyes on those who live as we do. In our lives, we're always following somebody. And we're always picking up on cues that people give. And he's like, if you're going to follow somebody's example, be diligent and be strategic. Follow either my example, as you've seen me live among you, or follow the example of people who try to live like me, who are just all trying to grow closer in our relationship with Jesus. And so in our lives, there are people who are further along in the Christian faith that you should look at and model their Bible study habits and their prayer behavior and how they treat people. Like, you just need to see the way people who live, who are further along spiritually than you, and model that behavior. Because without realizing it, you could end up following somebody who is leading you down a path of destruction. Because he says there are different types of people in the world. There are people who are trying to live for Jesus, and there are people who clearly aren't. And in verse 18, he talks about the latter. he says, "For as I have often told you before, and now tell you again, even with tears, many live as enemies of the cross of Christ. Their destiny is destruction, their God is their stomach, and their glory is in their shame." Now, many live as enemies to the cross of Christ, not because Jesus has declared them an enemy, but because they've declared themselves Jesus' enemy. And that declaration, it's not a one-and-done thing where it's like, well, I don't want to live for Jesus, and I'm going to live opposed to him, and so that you can never be brought back. Like, we all come into this world technically as enemies of the cross of Christ. It's not until we enter a relationship with Jesus that all changes. And there's always hope for someone to enter a relationship with Jesus. But when he describes this group of people that kind of draw a line in the sand and live as enemies to the cross of Christ, look at what he says about them in terms of his response to them. "I tell you again," so he's had this conversation before, "even with tears." Like, Paul is moved in that. When he thinks about lost people, when he thinks about people who live apart from a relationship with Jesus, he doesn't respond with apathy, like, I don't care about them. He doesn't respond with well, look, that's their choice and they can do what they want. He doesn't respond with well, they've got the gospel. I mean, you just think about in our context. I mean, there are churches all over the place. The village of Woodlawn has like 700 people and 2 churches. There are churches everywhere. And that didn't even count like Boyd, which is not really anywhere, and Fouts, which is not really anywhere, Mount Catherine, which isn't really anywhere, and Westlawn, which really isn't anywhere. Like, they're just county churches. Like, there are churches everywhere. So in our context, we may say, well, if they want to go to church, they want to learn about Jesus, just start driving, and in 5 minutes, you're going to run into one. But that's not how Paul thinks. He's like, man, when I talk about the people who live as enemies to the cross, I got tears in my eyes. It bothers me. And it bothers me because they don't understand the decision they're really making. And he says about them, I'm going to start at the bottom and work my way up. He says their glory is in their shame. That is to say, the thing that they celebrate the most in their lives, the thing that they're the most proud of, is often the thing that takes them further away from Jesus. Just think of the proverbial frat guy who is always trying to hook up with ladies, and the more ladies he hooks up with, the more that he brags and feels good about himself. Well, that's his glory in that moment is in his shame. He takes the most pride in something that's actually taking him further away from God and ruining him for future relationships. Well, this just plays out in all different types of ways in our lives. That when the people of this world think about their life, the things that they get the most excited about oftentimes, and the things they want to boast about more than anything else, is the things that ultimately bring them the most shame in God's eyes and more separation from him. But when you enter a relationship with Jesus, you just see things differently. And your glory is not in anything that the world has to offer. It's not in anything you're able to do. In fact, in the previous section, remember, the Apostle Paul is talking. He's like, hey, if we're going to boast, it's in the cross of Christ. If we're going to boast, it's in the work of Jesus. We're not going to boast in our accomplishments and what we're able to do because we know that we're not that good. We're going to boast in Jesus and what he's done and who he is. And so there's this like major dichotomy between these two groups. He also says their God is their stomach. The people of the world, when they have an urge or when they have a want or a desire, they just fill it. And they think of it oftentimes as a need that they're trying to fill, but it's like, hey, this is what I want. I have this appetite, and it's not wrong for me to go have it. Like they worship the God of their stomach or the God of their urges. They just do and want whatever they desire and whatever they want to have. This is the way they live. Now, if you've lived that way for very long, you begin to realize that you start going down that path very much, and it's going to come back to bite you pretty doggone quick. Well, the people of this world may not always realize it, and when there's chaos and turmoil, when there's broken relationships and bills that can't be paid, they can't figure out why they can't get all this to work. It's because their God is their stomach. See, whenever we worship Jesus, we recognize and we're shown. Over time, the more we study his word, the more that we pray and the Holy Spirit convicts our hearts, we realize there are certain things that just aren't good for us, even though we want them and we have desires for them. They're not good for us, and they hurt us, and they wreck our lives. We've been clued in on that because God is showing us a better way to live, which doesn't make us better than anybody else, but it means our God isn't our stomach. It's not our desires or our urges. Our God is King Jesus, who tells us how it is we're supposed to live our lives. And then, and this is probably the part that gets Paul, because the latter two have to deal with our earthly experience. And there is a benefit to following Jesus in the here and now, obviously. But usually when we think about entering a relationship with Jesus, we think about eternity probably more than anything. And he says their destiny is destruction. Like they've got a one-way ticket right now to eternal separation from God. And when we think about hell and when we describe hell, and people have all different ways of thinking about it and processing it, and people outside the Christian faith looking in, they either think it doesn't exist or they think that's where all the fun's going to be in the afterlife, and they don't really think that they'll go there maybe sometimes because, well, if I'm relatively a good person, then like surely I'll get into heaven. Like we just get this wrong in so many different ways. But Paul's like, look, you die without a relationship with Jesus, you've got one destiny, and it's destruction. And that's the thing about Paul. He's not standing on a street corner condemning people and telling them they're going to hell. He just weeps for them. And then he gets up every day and travels all over the Roman Empire, planting churches in different cities and in different regions, hoping that the people who live as enemies of the cross of Christ might be clued in and told a better way to live and a different way to think, so that their destiny can be changed, their forever can be different, and their life in the here and now might be blessed and might be better. It probably kept him up at night. It's what kept him going each and every day, to know that he can impact eternity for just one person. So Paul is moved. I want you to think for a moment. Let's think about our lives. And if you start thinking about, and it's weird, it's like, you think about the world. It's hard to even wrap your mind around how big the world is and how many people occupy the planet. But statistically speaking, I think it's safe to say that more people live as enemies to the cross of Christ than people that have accepted, according to them. And I think even those who say they entered a relationship with Jesus, I think even a lot of those are still on the outside looking in. Because Jesus talks about a narrow path and a small gate you've got to get through, and then this super highway with a broad gate that leads to destruction. And more people are on the broad than on the narrow, and I think that even includes churches in some ways. Now, when Paul thinks about those people, he weeps. And when we think about those people, we go, yeah, that's bad. And then we change the channel, and we get distracted with something else. Or when we think about the people in our lives who don't know Jesus, and we realize every person's life, there's an expiration date, and even time itself, and the planet has an expiration date, and it's always clicking down. There's never a pause. We don't know when it's going to go off, but we know it's going to get there soon. We just kind of do our own thing. We're busy. We got stuff we got Christmas shopping to finish up. Yeah, people are going to die without Jesus, but my kids, I got to get those presents wrapped, get them under the tree. Like, that's the way we think. We're so task-oriented and event-oriented, and we're consumed with getting certain things done. And Paul's like, you know that there are people in your neighborhood or in your family or that play on your team or whatever, like, they don't know Jesus? Paul weeps for them, and we're just kind of like, Which do you think more reflects God's character and God's heart and God's mindset? That's rhetorical, by the way, because we all know the answer. But we got to start having something stirred inside of us to make us think and act more like the Apostle Paul. Now, he goes on and he sums up this group of people, a group of people that he loves and that he wants to see their lives changed. He said, here's their mindset. Their mind is set on earthly things. Some of them don't see past tomorrow. Some of them don't see certainly past the end of their life. Like they're consumed with what's going to happen in the here and now, and they're consumed with how things are going now, and they're not concerned or worried about forever. Now, I will say this. A lot of times, as Jesus followers, we have the same mindset as those who don't follow Jesus. We get consumed and obsessed with what would be called earthly things. And we got to be careful and mindful not to live our lives according to the patterns of this world, and like forever is not a real thing. Because that changes how you have conversations. It changes how you treat people. It changes how you build relationships, how you spend your time, how you spend your money. Everything changes when verse 20 comes into play, when you realize that our citizenship is in heaven. Now, for the church in Philippi became a Roman colony, and they were very proud that they had a special level of citizenship given to them by Rome and by the Caesar. So when he says our citizenship is in heaven, we just kind of read that and we go, yeah, we know what that means. It means we're concerned with things of heaven, and we're worried about the kingdom of heaven and not any kingdom in this world. But for them to hear, wait a minute, our citizenship is in heaven, well, we're really proud of the citizenship we have in Rome. Now, it's not wrong to be proud of your earthly citizenship, but it becomes a problem when those two citizenships come into conflict with one another. Like, you can have dual citizenship here, right? Like, you can be a citizen of Canada and a citizen of America. But what happens if those two countries go to war? I know that's laughable. That wouldn't last long, would it? Because Canada is not really going to take on America. I get it. Just go with me, though. What happens if the two countries that you have a citizenship with go to war? You have to choose one or the other. Well, in the same way, where is your ultimate citizenship? Is it on earth or is it in heaven? So we got to recognize that when push comes to shove, our mind, our heart has to be set not on earthly things but on heavenly things, and that our ultimate citizenship is in heaven. And that does change the way that we live on a day-to-day basis. Now he goes on, he talks about the benefit of those who have their citizenship in heaven. He says, and we eagerly await a Savior from there, the Lord Jesus Christ, who by the power that enables him to bring everything under his control. So Jesus is Lord over everything, and all will be brought under his authority at the full consummation of his kingdom and when time stops. And the same power that puts everything under the lordship of Jesus, that same power will transform our lowly bodies so that they will be like his glorious body. So when you die and when eternity starts, like when Jesus comes back and everything is made right, we'll be given new bodies. The bodies that we have now feel the effects of sin. Like Adam and Eve, when they were placed in the garden, there were two trees. There was a tree of knowledge and there was a tree of life. And they weren't supposed to eat of the tree of knowledge to bring evil into the world. They were supposed to eat of the tree of life and live forever. Essentially, they were supposed to live with this imperishable body. But when they brought sin into the world, now there are all kinds of issues and all kinds of tension and all kinds of pains and headaches and heartaches. And you think about, like, did you get up this morning, knees popping a little bit and back hurting? Like, that's just like entry-level type stuff. But your glorious body, you won't have that. You're like, woohoo! I'll be able to play basketball, not even stretch. Be great. Yeah, probably so. I don't know how it all works. In fact, a lot of people ask me, so, like, will I be given new bodies? Will I still kind of look like me? Because if so, I've got some requests that I want to make to maybe change. Maybe you want to be taller. Or maybe you're like, I want to look like the 20-something-year-old version of me and not the current version. And, like, what about little kids? Do they get to be 20-something as well? Like, how does this all work? I have no idea. And people do, when we start talking about this, they start asking me specific questions. I don't know the answer to anything because we're not really given detail. All we're told is we're given a new body. Like, our soul was never meant to exist without a body or a tent or a shell. Well, the shell that we have is a perishable shell. It feels the effects of sin. It is breaking down. And even if you have a lot of miles on your shell or you don't have hardly any, it does have the effects of sin kind of stapled into it. We're given a glorious body that we'll have forever that will not break down. No maintenance need to be done on it. It's just going to be good from like day one until like 2 billion years of you being in heaven. I just process that. That's just really hard to even wrap your mind around. The idea or the concept of eternity. Eternity in God's presence. Well, Paul knows what's at stake here. And he talks about the blessings that are given to those who have a citizenship in heaven, And when you start thinking about the blessings, you also think about the curse that people who don't have a relationship with Jesus ultimately bring on themselves, and it causes something. At least it should stir something within our hearts and within our soul. In fact, here's our bottom line for today. Remember with tears those in your life that don't know Jesus. Don't just remember those in your life that don't know Jesus and go, yeah, they should know better. Or, yeah, we grew up in the same church when we were kids and they went away, but they know the truth and they can come back if they want. And like it's on them and everything's on them and I don't really care about them. Paul's like, I don't think that way. He doesn't just remember those who don't know Jesus. He remembers with tears those in his life that don't know Jesus. And see, whenever we start to think of people, and here's the shift that needs to happen. We need to be thinking about people in our lives that don't know Jesus and how God might use us to bring them into a relationship with him. But like once we start to think about and realize who God might be sending us to, so to speak, we have got to really feel for them and want them to experience everything you've experienced in Jesus. We have got to want them to have what we have in the here and now and forever. And you've got to be moved to tears, if, so to speak. And you may think, I don't cry. I cried during Old Yeller, and I cried during the movie Hoosiers, but other than that, I don't cry. That's fine. It's a metaphor, okay? You don't have to literally cry. But you need to be moved. Something has to stir within your heart. You can't just keep seeing the people that you love each and every day who don't know Jesus and then just not really experience anything. Because that will keep you from doing what it is that God wants you to do. And when we think about our lives, think about first the people in your life that don't know Jesus, but then also remember that there's an entire world of people that don't know Jesus as well. And how might God use your time, energy, and resources to bring them into a relationship with Jesus? In fact, for the Apostle Paul, he was so passionate about this. In the book of Romans, he talks about his fellow Jews, his brothers and sisters by not only religion, but also like blood, by heritage, ancestry. And he says, man, they've rejected Jesus and they don't get what following God's all about. I was there with them and I was even worse than they were. But man, I would give up my salvation just so that they would accept the gift of grace. I would be eternally condemned for their benefit. That's how Paul thinks about it. Like Paul loved his countrymen so much, and he didn't know all their names, he didn't know who they were, but he loved them all so much. He's like, if I could trade my salvation for their condemnation, I would. That's what went through Paul's mind when he thought about people that don't know Jesus and live apart from a relationship with him. Now we're about to go into the Christmas celebration season. We've been in the Christmas season since Halloween, basically. But like it's officially Christmas week now. And you may be getting together with family. Now maybe we're going to stay away because of COVID and all that stuff. I mean, I get it. Well, here's my challenge to you. It's going to be a big challenge. If talking about politics is going to hinder the conversation about Jesus with someone in your family who doesn't know Jesus, maybe don't talk politics. Just don't do it. Don't take the bait. Don't start debating. Because I've been in the rooms when those debates happen, and they're funny to watch. I make popcorn. I'm like, this is going to be good. But they don't really do anything for helping people. Like, it's usually just really chaotic, and people get red-faced and start yelling. And the content you can't even put on YouTube because it gets pretty crazy. Like, I don't want to be the guy who's arguing because then I can't really talk about Jesus. If you're an anti-vaxxer or you're a pro-vaxxer and somebody else is not, they're the other way, let's not talk COVID vaccine over Christmas celebration because it's going to cause tension. Like there are 1,000 things that we could just go through a list. Hey, maybe don't mention that. Or maybe don't make a big point about that. And maybe your Facebook feed should be less involved with all that stuff. Now, you want to have a Cards Cub debate. I think that's allowed, okay? Because that's part of salvation. the cardinal stuff, okay? But everything else, just leave it. Because Paul's not going to debate politics or vaccines if he thinks it's going to be a stumbling block to introduce somebody. All he cares about is Jesus. He's like, get the vaccine, don't get the vaccine. You're still going to die and you still need Jesus. That's what Paul would say. So for us, let's live our lives so strategically that we would say, I'm willing to lay my opinions down so that I might introduce this person to Jesus, or at the very least, be light and show them the love of Jesus by the way that I live. Now, that's challenging, I know. Because you've read 3 articles on Facebook and you know all it is there is to know about whatever it is, fill in the blank. And you just got to share your opinions. And you watch Dr. So-and-so, and they're just so smart. And you memorize their, and you want to like, boom. You want to serve them at Christmas. And I'm not talking about turkey. I'm talking about, oh. That didn't end well. Never does. You might feel good for like 30 seconds, but it never ends well. I'm asking you to lay that down for the sake of Jesus. Because when you're moved to tears and you have compassion or empathy for somebody who needs Christ in their life, you're willing to do whatever it takes to introduce them to Jesus. Paul, he was shipwrecked. He was whipped several times. He was falsely thrown in prison. He's in prison as he's writing the book of Philippians for years. And he's willing to do it all so that somebody might meet Jesus. And so I think we can make these little adjustments to our lives so that the people we love might know Jesus. That's my challenge to you. Ask God to give you a heart like Paul's. Ask God to give you a heart like his heart. That you see people who are lost and tears come to your eyes and you can't help but do everything you can to introduce them to Jesus.